Eddie, thank you so much for being here. I know that you are in high demand and busy, and we really appreciate you taking a little time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me on the show today.
I'm going to start with the same two questions I ask all of my guests. The first one's just to get us to know you a little bit more personally. Could you complete the sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
That's a tough one, but I'll have to go with that. I'm from Philly.
Yeah, I'm from Philly too.
Oh, you are? I didn't know that.
I'm from West Philly, 45th and Osage.
Oh, man. I feel like it's an identity that can run deep. I haven't lived in the Philadelphia area since I graduated from high school. Even my young kids growing up in New York, they will never be allowed to be New York sports fans. They have to be Eagles and Sixers and Flyers and Phillies fans. Awesome. And I think growing up in Philly, it's a certain down-to-earth quality that you appreciate. It's not a city with much pretentiousness. It's also a city that knows how to endure suffering over long periods of time. Although lately, our sports teams have been a lot better. And I think it's also a city that appreciates the things that have always made America such an amazing country, like the liberty and freedom that are at the very heart of what we are as a country. My wife's from Philly. I'm from Philly. No matter where I live, that's where my heart will always be. My wife and I grew up 15 minutes away from each other. We went to college together, but we didn't meet until we were out of college, living in Washington. I was working at the State Department and she was working at Treasury. I'm sure the fact that we had that connection, that shared background, was part of what brought us together.
Yeah, no, we could talk about Philly. I went to my first Super Bowl. My wife's from New Orleans, and the Super Bowl was the Eagles against that team in New Orleans. We went together. It was like a religious experience.
Amazing. I love it.
I'm a big fan of the soccer team, the Union, and I watch every game. So I'm a big Philly fan as well. Awesome.
Well, we can glad you asked me that.
This is a podcast about strategy. I ask this question of every guest. I always get a different answer. What's your definition of strategy?
Maybe one way I would look at it comes from my own experience. When I was in government, I worked in both operational roles as well as on what's called the policy planning staff, which is this group working directly for the Secretary of State. It was founded by this iconic American diplomat named George Kennan, who came up with the whole containment policy against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's really the one place in the U.S. foreign policy apparatus that's charged with strategy. The way I would think about it is if operations is about winning today, strategy is about how to put yourself in the position to win tomorrow.
Yes, I love that. Great. But we could dig further into that, but we have so much to cover and we don't have as much time with you as you deserve. So let's shift into this concept of choke points. You use the term choke points in your book, and that's the primary focus of it. What is a choke point, and could you give us an example of one at work today?
Sure. So choke points are areas of the global economy in which one country has a dominant position, and there are few, if any, substitutes. I'll illustrate, because I think sometimes when you hear the term choke point, you just think about the dominance element and not about the substitution element. Let's say, for instance, 90% of all textile manufacturing, clothing manufacturing were concentrated in China. It's not the case, but let's use that as a theoretical. If China then tomorrow were to ban T-shirts from being exported to the United States, it wouldn't be hard for the US to create its own textile industry from scratch. There's no rocket science to it. It would be more expensive, but we could do it in relatively short order if we needed to. And by the way, I think there was an example of this during COVID when China banned the export of medical masks to the United States. It caused some panic because we were in the middle of a crisis, but within a few months, the US had robust supplies of its own domestically produced masks. A choke point is something where you couldn't readily substitute that. To use another Chinese example, this one that's very real and visceral because it's live right now, is in the spring of this year, China banned the export of rare earth minerals to the United States. These are minerals that are essential for the production of high performance magnets used in automobiles and a variety of other higher end manufactured products. For many of these rare earth minerals, China produces 99% of the world's supply. And while it would theoretically be possible for the US to mine and refine its own rare earths, in order to do that, it would probably take several years and cost us a lot of money. And so it's not readily available as a substitute. As a result, China successfully used that dominance, that choke point over rare earth minerals to essentially win the first phase of the trade war with the Trump administration this past spring.
Got it. So I'm linking this to the business strategic concept of the resource-based view, and that resource needs to be valuable, not substitutable, and not easily replicable for it to be valuable.
Exactly. I think these are the interesting thing, and it's a good thing that you at Outthinkers bring together people who are in business as well as folks like me who have been in business, but also in foreign policy. There are a lot of concepts that are well known to business strategists that are more novel to folks in national security and foreign policy, and vice versa. So I think there's quite a bit our fields can learn from each other.
Agree. Yeah, I think a lot of the business concepts that are dominant today came in from either military or political sides. We call it something differently, and then we think we've invented it. But yeah, great. So you were with us in New York at our summit and one of the highest rated sessions that we've ever had. So thank you so much for doing that. One thing that our members came out repeating was the impossible trinity. I was wondering if you could unpack that for us. What is the impossible trinity?
Sure. My book, Choke Points, tells the story of how we moved from the win-win globalization of the 1990s to what I call the age of economic warfare we're living in today, in which sanctions, export controls, and tariffs have become the primary way that countries are competing with each other. And this rise of economic warfare over the last 2 decades has progressed in a secular fashion across administrations of both parties in the United States, and increasingly is a global trend. It's not just the US using these weapons of economic warfare, it's also the EU, the UK, Japan, China, and many other countries besides. And so for anyone who's read the book will know it's a narrative history. It really gets you behind the scenes of how this era developed over the last several decades. But at the same time, when I came to the very end of telling the story, the end of writing the book, I had to appreciate that there was this secular trend. And I decided to put my mind to try to understand what was driving it, because there had to be some sort of structural factor driving this trend, given that it wasn't just one or two people who were really initiating it. I was walking around my neighborhood in New York City one day, and it occurred to me that there is a structural underpinning. It's what I call the Geo-Economic Impossible Trinity, in which you have these 3 factors: economic interdependence, economic security, and geopolitical competition. Only 2 can be maximized at once. You cannot maximize all 3 at the same time. I'll explain some real world examples. During the Cold War, you had very intense geopolitical competition between the West and the Soviet Union. Really, everything about our relationship with the Soviet Union was based on conflict. But we didn't have any real economic interdependence. The Soviet Union was not dependent on the dollar for its economic health, nor was the United States dependent on the ruble. We weren't buying large quantities of raw materials or weapons from the Soviet Union or vice versa. As a result, even though there was this intense geopolitical competition, we could retain a sense of economic security because we weren't worried about the Soviet Union weaponizing choke points against us or vice versa. Then when the Cold War ends, you no longer have any geopolitical competition to speak of. In the 1990s, it's what we call the unipolar moment, when the United States was this unquestioned superpower. And we really viewed countries like China and Russia and the other post-Soviet states more as potential friends than rivals. And so given that geopolitical competition had melted away, we were free to embrace economic interdependence. We were able to deeply embed China and Russia into our supply chains. Russia and China started using the dollar for pretty much all of their cross-border payments and investments. And no one was really worried about that because we viewed them as potential friends. There was no geopolitical competition. But what we have today and what's really developed over the last decade is that geopolitical competition has come back with a vengeance, where the US, China, and Russia are bitter rivals.
Yes.
While economic interdependence persists. And so the result is that this third quality that I think in many senses is the most important to us as a country, which is economic security. We've lost that sense. When I say we, it's certainly true in the United States, right? Where we very much fear China being able to coerce us economically. But it's also true everywhere else in the world. China has spent the last decade pouring hundreds of billions of dollars in domestic self-sufficiency, really to try to shield itself from economic pressure from the United States. Russia has made similar investments in alternative platforms to SWIFT. They have their own financial messaging platform called SPFS. The EU has an economic security strategy. Japan even has a cabinet level minister for economic security. So I think what we see today is that every country around the world in imposing these tariffs and sanctions and export controls and industrial policies, it's really a haphazard effort to try to reclaim a sense of economic security in this new world marked by intense geopolitical competition.
Okay. And how should I be thinking about these three? Are these three at a global level or at a country level with different combinations of countries? Like, I can have economic security between two countries or a bloc, or is it all three?
It's a great question. I think you could really view it at any of those levels. Most important is a level between countries, right? An example would be the Cold War at the macro level of the international system. There was intense geopolitical rivalry between the West and the Soviet Union. We were able to have economic security only because we didn't have economic interdependence, right? But within the West itself, between the US and Europe, we did have economic interdependence during the Cold War, but we didn't have a sense of geopolitical competition. And so we retained economic security. It's a good point you make, in that it depends on the lens that you're looking at in terms of which of the two you're going to maximize.
Okay. So then if I just generalize globally, maybe more with a US European perspective, because that's sort of my natural one. What I'm hearing you say is we did have economic security with economic interdependence, but now competition has emerged and reduced economic security. So where do you think we're headed? Are we headed back to security with interdependence? Are we headed to more competition and less interdependence, but economic security? Or are we going to have a prolonged period of not having economic security?
Yeah, great question. I think we are going to have some period where we have a significant lack of economic security. Fixing that problem is not something you can just do overnight. The different options, whether that's shedding economic interdependence or geopolitical competition, are really challenging. My own view is the likeliest outcome is that over the next decade, you will see significantly less economic interdependence between the US and geopolitical rivals, particularly China, but also Russia and others as well. I think that's because geopolitical competition is one of these where I think actually what President Trump is trying to do to a certain extent now is to see if he can make peace with the Chinese and the Russians. My own view is that our geopolitical interests are just so divergent right now, and that there's so little overlap in the Venn diagram of what we're trying to achieve in the world that I don't think that will be successful. So I think we are going to have more of a move away from economic interdependence. I think the question then becomes, what does that look like? Because there are different ways that can manifest. One would be that we sort of revert to a global economic superstructure that kind of mirrors what we had during the Cold War, where there's less interdependence between the US and China, but more interdependence between the US and other friendly countries, be it Canada and Mexico in our own hemisphere, or Europe, or democracies in Asia like Japan and Korea and Singapore and India. That's one possible future. But another, and this is, I think, where we'll end up if we don't have strategy. And this gets back to your first question about winning today versus winning tomorrow. I think if all we're doing is optimizing for the present moment, which frankly has been the policy of the last several presidents, we will end up with something that looks more like autarky. If we don't have guardrails in terms of who we're imposing sanctions or tariffs or export controls against, as we've seen during the Trump administration so far, there have been these economic pressure tools deployed against everyone. It's not just been the Chinas and Russias of the world. It's been Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japan, really every country in the world. Yes. I do worry that we could end up in something that's more chaotic, where it's effectively every country for itself. And I don't think that will be the optimal world for the United States to be in.
Yeah, there's three places I want to go with that. You're making me think of these T-shirts I've seen, like America versus the world. I've seen that as a kind of a tagline. Where did the drive for competition come from? Like there's one kind of military theory that I read, which was conflict emerges when there are two visions for the future that are inconsistent or incompatible. Talk to us about what drives, because I can observe that there was less competition, more interdependence, and now there is more, but why?
If we could solve that, we would have produced an incredible theoretical breakthrough. There are a lot of different perspectives in terms of what drives competition. If we're being really practical, there are a few ways to look at it. In the 1990s, right after the end of the Cold War, the Russia that emerged from the Soviet Union actively was pursuing integration with the West. They wanted to be a democratic capitalist country that was part of Western institutions. China wanted to be integrated with the West economically, but never really sought democracy, right? So both Russia and China spent a lot of effort trying to get into the World Trade Organization, for instance, right? Russia was pursuing closer ties with the European Union. China never really moved in the democratic direction, but was trying for economic interdependence. I think what happened was that once both countries regained their footing economically, and this was really after China had entered the WTO, and once Russia had rebuilt its economy on the backs of this commodities boom that happened in the first decade of the 21st century, when oil prices went up by tenfold in 10 years, which is essential to rebuilding Russian strength after the Cold War. I think once both countries became strong economically, neither of which had developed in a democratic direction, which was not super surprising for China in retrospect, because they never explicitly wanted that. With Russia, a little surprising because they did want it. And some of the other former communist countries, like Poland, for instance, did become functional democracies. Once they regained their economic strength, they started looking around and saying, we want the geopolitical environment to reflect that strength. For Russia, that means having a sphere of influence in its neighborhood. During the 90s and 2000s, the countries in its neighborhood had all gravitated to the West. Many had actually joined the EU and NATO. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, had become members of both the EU and NATO. Countries like Ukraine and Georgia wanted to be part of both the EU and NATO, and were moving in that direction. I think that Russia's geopolitical designs ran into the aspirations of the countries that had previously been in its sphere of influence. And I think with China, you've seen a similar process. The only difference being that the countries in China's neighborhood are even stronger than the ones in Russia's neighborhood. You've got countries like Japan and Korea, which in and of themselves are substantial economic and technological powers, and both of which it's been a very long time since either of them has been under the hegemony of China. So I think that Chinese aspirations for a sphere of influence in its neighborhood in the East and South China Sea bumped up against Japan, Korea, India, and the Philippines.
It's almost like it contains them.
This is the problem of international relations, when you have different countries that have different perspectives of what they want. And it's not abnormal for countries to want to chart their own geopolitical future. It's harder when you have an aspiring hegemon like China or Russia seeking to assert dominance over other countries. Historically, you do that through military conquest. And that's hard in an era of nuclear weapons and where the US is still the most powerful military on the face of the earth.
I think that for strategy leaders, they need to have some kind of, not that they can predict, but they probably need to understand what kind of the leading indicators or drivers that would kind of tell us where we're going. And one of those is the individual. Because when I think of Russia's intentions, I think of Putin. Right now, as we're recording this, it's Donald Trump. There are these individuals. But when I talk to people who have studied patterns over centuries, the other view is that no individual really has much influence. So maybe it comes from some kind of long-term cultural movement or something, and the leader is the representative of the people or something like that. But can an individual like Trump or Putin, or can an individual president, does history tell us that they can really direct the forces in the direction of competition?
So individuals definitely matter. And I think one thing that I often find interesting is when folks who've had more business backgrounds come in to work in national security and foreign policy, and they have their first few meetings in the Situation Room. Oftentimes their reaction is, this is it. It's just like a board meeting where we're deciding these big questions of US foreign policy, the same way that we used to decide our quarterly sales plan or something like that. And the answer is, yeah, that's it. It's human beings with all of their flaws, all of their prejudices, sitting around a table making these decisions. In the US system, you do have a lot that's decided by the president, who's the commander in chief. The president does have a lot of influence. I would have never written my book Choke Points the way I did, where it really is based on individuals. It takes you through the decision making of the key characters who built the age of economic warfare, if I didn't think that they mattered. At the same time, a framework like the Geo-Economic Impossible Trinity respects the fact that structures do matter too. We do exist within structural reality, structural constraints. And so I would analogize this to business. If you have a Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos level CEO, chances are the company is going to do quite well. But if you took those types of CEOs and you put them in a losing industry, if you made Jeff Bezos the CEO of Xerox 20 years ago, he may not have been as successful.
Washington Post.
Right? There are certain fundamental drivers and also personal factors. I think the key to national strategy, to foreign policy, is understanding both and really trying to make the most of the resources that you as a country have at your disposal.
So, what do you think the role of businesses are, like a large business, a Microsoft or an Apple? Should they be thinking of their strategy as predicting and adapting to what's already happening or what's going to happen? Or should they try to influence the direction?
They should try to influence the direction. This is a big takeaway from my own work, my own writing. So, what is economic statecraft? What are sanctions? What are tariffs? What are industrial policies? They're the government trying to affect the incentive structures of business to achieve a national goal. And normally, businesses have a straightforward incentive structure to make as much money as possible, maximize shareholder value. The government can come in and say, it might be the profit maximizing strategy for you to buy oil from Russia. But if you do that, we're going to fine you an astronomical amount of money, and it's going to wipe out your entire profit for the year. And so if the government does that, you're affecting the calculus of a private sector actor, right? And that's all sanctions are, right? The US government doesn't actually freeze anyone's assets. The US government doesn't block ships from going to one country or the next. They just change the incentive structure of what businesses should do, especially if you're a company operating in a sector where the sanctions or tariffs are affecting your business. You need to proactively engage with the US government. You don't want to be in a situation where some sort of sanctions policy comes down that's terrible for your business and you're scrambling to Washington to explain to policymakers who know nothing about your industry why they totally mess things up for you. Well, you want to be talking to policymakers, not just advocating for yourself, your industry, but really trying to understand what they're trying to achieve. What are their objectives vis-a-vis China? What are their objectives vis-a-vis Russia? How does your industry figure into that strategy? And how can you educate policymakers about how executives in your industry think? Because I think if you do that, you're much less likely to get some sort of policy coming out of Washington or Brussels or whatever capital you're engaging with that is totally asinine. I think it's very incumbent. We talked about this a little bit at the last session that we did in New York. I think it's very important for businesses today, chief strategy officers, whether if you have a chief geopolitical officer, to really engage with these topics and go beyond lobbying to really sharing conversations
Education,
with government officials. Exactly.
Yeah. Got it. And I imagine like your voice maybe carries more weight if you are sitting or you're part of one of these choke points, right? Like right now, semiconductors are one of the defining choke points today. What do you think the next choke points are likely to be over the next decade?
I think you're right. It's a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because, the government's going to be intervening in your industry. You're not going to be able to be neutral in the US, Russia or US, China competition. The benefit is if you play it to your advantage, you could wind up being a strategic sector that the government's investing in. We're seeing that just in the last few months where the US government took the really unprecedented step of buying 15% of MP materials, the rare earth mine in California, where the DoD actually took a 15% equity stake in the company and devoted billions of dollars to offtake agreements, buying their product years into the future. Right now, as of this recording, the US government reportedly is in conversations to buy 10% of Intel, which is remarkable. It's seen as a strategic necessity to have one of these blue chip semiconductor firms, and Intel obviously has been struggling. It can cut both ways. In terms of emerging choke points, I laid this out earlier in terms of what a choke point is. Just because a choke point exists doesn't mean that the US government or some other government's weaponizing it. There are plenty of choke points that exist that are probably not even on the radar of the US government. There are some that the US government hasn't weaponized by convention. You can think about things like cloud computing, where massive market share belongs to US firms like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. You don't see the US trying to kick people off of global cloud infrastructure, even though we very well could do that. Central bank swap lines, where the Fed is providing dollar liquidity to banks around the world, effectively backstop the entire global financial system in a technocratic, apolitical way, something theoretically the US could weaponize. The organization that oversees all web domain names is a US entity that theoretically the US could leverage for economic warfare. We've decided not to. In terms of where the choke points are headed, and there are ones that are relatively foreseeable. If artificial intelligence does permeate business operations the way we think they will, there will be choke points across the stack. We already know that computing power is a choke point in terms of the NVIDIA chips necessary to train best-in-class artificial intelligence algorithms, and in some ways inference as well. But it could be that some of these models themselves turn out being choke points if one of them really races ahead of the other. If you have a point where the models themselves are commoditized, which I don't think is likely, and they wouldn't be, but if it's a world that we're living in which in order to run best-in-class AI, you need a contract either with OpenAI, Anthropic, or maybe one or two other firms. That's going to be a choke point. And it's essential, I think, for the US government standpoint that those companies are American. I think in the energy sector, we already see emerging choke points. The frightening thing from the American perspective is that most of them really belong to China. These rare earth minerals or critical minerals like lithium, where the mining isn't necessarily in China, but the processing largely takes place in China, the refining capacities in China. And then batteries themselves, which is an area that China completely dominates and has actually already weaponized against the US. Something that sort of flew under the radar. The biggest drone company in the US, a company called Skydio, was sanctioned by China a few months ago. And they actually had to ration batteries so that their customers only got one battery per drone, which if you're using a drone for some sort of industrial use case, it's not really tenable to only have a single battery.
Right.
And then, of course, electric vehicles, where it seems like the US right now under the current Trump administration is deprioritizing the energy transition. But around the world, every country really is appreciating that they want to electrify their transportation fleet. We're at a point right now where China completely dominates the electric vehicle industry.
Do you think that's part of the calculus, that someone in the government realizes that a clean energy system gives more power to China?
I think there was an awareness of that during the Biden administration too. The Biden administration's response was twofold. They imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So basically prevented Chinese EVs from coming into the US market to protect the Teslas and GMs of the world from Chinese competition. The second thing they did was the Inflation Reduction Act, where they funneled large amounts of subsidy into the clean energy industry domestically. Bill that passed earlier this year, a number of the subsidies that were put in place have been rolled back. One of the most well-known is the electric vehicle tax credit, where you used to be able to claim a tax credit for buying EVs, which is being phased out. So I do think that some of Trump's policies are going to set us back even further. And look, could we exist domestically with just a normal fossil fuel driven transportation fleet? And right now I'm setting aside climate change, which I personally believe is a serious problem to contend with. But let's say, could we? Sure, we could persist in that world. But the rest of the world is sprinting headlong into electric vehicles. And that's going to give China a tremendous amount of leverage. If the US is fully all in on gasoline powered vehicles, that is ultimately putting us at the mercy of the international oil market. And, we've been living over the last decade in this halcyon period where the US is actually exporting more oil than it imports because of the shale revolution. But shale producers in the US have a relatively high break-even price. So they don't make money if the oil price goes below $60 a barrel. And there are many producers around the world, as in Saudi Arabia, where they've got a break-even price of $5 or $10. So as oil prices drop, assuming oil demand goes down over the next decade,
as electric vehicle demand goes up,
as oil, the U.S. shale industry risks extinction. Basically, it's only Saudi Arabia and countries in the Persian Gulf and Russia, because they've got low production costs, producing all the oil in the world. And if the U.S. is dependent on that oil, we're going to be at the mercy of other countries.
So you can almost see the polarization becoming not only geographically defined, but sustainable energy versus oil, right? Because now there's greater interdependence between Saudi Arabia and the United States for gas-powered energy.
Yes, 100%. And I think this is why the energy transition actually is a geopolitical issue from the US. And maybe, again, not today, but in a 10-year perspective, it certainly is, because we do not want to be where we were in the 1970s, right? Where OPEC did an oil embargo against the US and it ground our entire economy to a halt and led to a decade of stagflation. We don't want to be in that position again. The virtue of clean energy is, sure, we're at a disadvantage relative to China right now. But if we're able to catch up, which I think we could, because this stuff isn't rocket science, it's really about investment and focus. If we're able to catch up in the next 5 to 10 years, the virtue of clean energy is that it's not concentrated in specific geographies, right? The wind blows, batteries might be able to store a tremendous amount of energy. You can build nuclear reactors wherever you want. So in some ways, it does buy you geopolitical independence. And I think that's why China has invested so heavily in it. China, right now, they are very much dependent on oil imports, and they don't want to be in that position.
I probably have one more question. I just want to know where you want to go. My ideas are this efficiency versus resilience question. Another one would be the investment in Intel and the investment in that rare minerals mine. Is that a new way that the government is engaging with business? Is that a tax, some form of tax, or is it something unprecedented?
Talk about that. That's interesting. This episode will come out how soon?
Like 3 weeks, something like that?
Yeah, okay, this is live stuff then. Let's talk about it.
I have so many more questions, but I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. You mentioned the government's investment in Intel and a possible investment in the rare earth mineral mining operation. Is this a new form of the way that the US government engages with the private sector? Tell us, what's the historical context of this? I hear some people say, this is unprecedented. We're becoming China. And others saying, it's just another form of taxation.
That's a good question in terms of taxation. I think in some ways it's the opposite. It's a handout to some of these companies. You look at MP Materials, for instance, when the government's investment, the 15% equity stake was announced, the company's share price doubled. The US government's already made a couple $100 million in paper gains on the investment in MP Materials. Right. You got to debate whether taxpayer funds are best used for this purpose. I think one way of viewing this is we're living in this age of economic warfare, sanctions, export controls, tariffs. They're just how countries compete today. In that kind of a world, you also need defense, right? It's not enough just to have the biggest and baddest sanctions. You need to be able to defend yourself against other countries being able to coerce you. We saw this past spring that China does have its foot on the US's neck when it comes to rare earths. It makes good sense for the US government to try to fix that market failure, correct the market failure, which China has 99% of global processing capacity. And they determined potentially correctly that the only way to do that is by taking a stake in this mine. Even just an offtake agreement without a sort of equity skin in the game for the US government wouldn't be enough to ensure this company's long-term survival. The other thing to note is in something like rare earths, it's a really remarkable industry. We saw how devastating the impact is to the US when we're cut off from Chinese rare earths. On an annualized basis, we import a couple $100 million worth of rare earths from China. It's a very small industry that operates on razor thin margins. The processing is very pollution heavy. And so there are a lot of reasons why the private sector itself hasn't done this. I think the question becomes, and I think we'll see if the Intel deal goes through, which would be a much bigger investment, buying 10% of Intel than 15% of a rare earth mine. The question I have in terms of whether the US can actually do industrial policy, obviously China has done industrial policy very well, is what is the tolerance in our democratic system for failure? Because in China, the government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on anything from domestic chip production to rare earth production. And we never hear about the 80% or 90% of that money that's wasted, the failed investments by the state that no one worries about because that's just kind of what you assume in China. I think in the US, politicians ultimately have to be accountable to voters. All of a sudden, the US government spends tens of billions of dollars buying a big stake in Intel, and then Intel stock collapses because they can't compete on the global marketplace and taxpayers lose a lot of money. You know, whoever bought that stake in Intel is going to have to answer to voters. So I'm personally skeptical that over the long run, the US is going to be able to do industrial policy in the same way that China does.
This is great. I mean, so many other things that we could dive into, but I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. How can people continue to connect with you, learn from you? Certainly, we're going to encourage them to buy your book. You've got a lot of great content podcasts. You're on CNBC or Wall Street, you're all over. But where would be the source if someone listens and says, okay, I need to dig deeper here with Eddie?
One is you can follow me on Twitter or X, if you will. I post at Edward Fishman is my handle. Probably the next level up is you can connect with me on LinkedIn, where I oftentimes am engaging with people in different industries. And my LinkedIn is just my name, Eddie Fishman. The final one, and this is an honest invitation, particularly if you decide to dive into my book, Choke Points, you're welcome to send me an email. I love hearing from people who've read my book. It's very fun for me to hear different reactions. So please feel free to do that and respond as soon as I have a chance to.
Well, we love it when thought leaders are open like that and they are interested in the topic and in the study and in the knowledge. So thank you for going out and doing all this work for us and sharing it here with us. I wish we had more time with you, but this is at least a good structural taste. Thank you, Eddie, for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.